This year has been a rough ride for me so far. I got out of a 3-year relationship last September, and work has been very hard to focus on. Before anyone suggests this, I am talking to someone, a professional. After a lot of weed use, many talks with my counsellor, and some more legitimate medication, this summer was supposed to be my time to start pulling myself out of the hole. So I rented this house. New place, new life, new me, you know. It was a nice enough place. 1,000 square feet, 1 bed, and 1.5 baths. It even had a lawn that I could see myself mowing throughout the summer months. The landlord gave me a tour before the lease was signed and finalised. The bathroom was a little small, but I wasn't looking for a lot of open space. I just wanted my little piece of the world, and this seemed like it could be it, at least for the 12-month-long leasing agreement. There was only one weird thing about my meagre home-to-be. I wanted to ask more questions when it came up during the tour, but I really didn't want to scrutinise a good thing. I'm afraid I made a large mistake. Murray MacDonald was a bigger, middle-aged man with a round face but weathered hands that he tucked into the back pockets of his jeans each time our tour took a little pause for me to survey the rooms. Our conversation through most of the half an hour or so I was there that day was little more than my eager questions being met with grunts to the affirmative or negative serving as answers. Each time we came to a new spot to inspect, Murray would turn to me, hands in his back pockets, and raise his dark eyebrows, etching several furrows in his forehead as he did so. It was a tired look that let me know just how happy the man was to be answering my questions. But I asked nonetheless. I have a questioning nature. My ex said so anyway. This process was played out in the living room, the bedroom, and both bathrooms. It was simple enough. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and I was feeling excited to move in. Then we came to the kitchen, and Murray's demeanour changed entirely. As he walked in, he moved quickly past me, down the narrow lane between the stove and the sink, and leaned his back against the wall on the far side of the room. It was the fastest I had ever seen him move since the tour began. I'll be honest and tell you it spooked me a little bit, but I shook it off, reaching for the thrilled feeling I'd been reveling in. The kitchen was definitely workable. It wasn't built for a team to cook in or anything, but once again, it would just be me. Everything was as clean as could be expected, and all the fixtures seemed to be in order. Satisfied, I turned with a smile to look at Murray, still leaning against the far wall. He wasn't looking at me. There were no raised eyebrows or lines of annoyance on his face. His eyes were wide and staring down at the tiled floor of the kitchen. His arms were crossed over his chest, and I spied a thin line of sweat running down his temple. The change from weary landlord to this alarmed state he seemed to be in now froze me where I stood. I stayed still and quiet for a moment that stretched over the interior of the little house like mist settling over the world. The moment passed, and I swallowed with a little effort and spoke at last. "Murray?" He jumped at the sound, his eyes wide, locking with mine. The intensity in that stare made me stumble back a bit. At that, Murray seemed to remember why we were here, shook his head a little, and stood up a little straighter before he spoke. "Sorry about that," he grumbled amicably. "Lost in thought for a minute there, I guess." "No worries," I laughed shakily. "It happens to me all the time." Not terribly convinced, I was ready to head out and leave this strange man to get lost in whatever thoughts he wanted to. I just wanted to get everything for the house settled and move forward. "Well, this all looks perfect," I said with a thin smile. "Anything else I should know about the place before I get moved in?" At this, Murray's face dropped a little. He took off his well-worn baseball cap and ran a hand through a thinning patch of dark hair beneath. Returning his gaze to me, Murray stepped away from the wall for the first time since we entered the kitchen, and I could finally see that it wasn't a wall he was standing in front of. It was a door. There wasn't anything special about its appearance. It was a simple white door. The doors in the rest of the house looked exactly the same as this one. In my mind, I thought this meant I had more closet space than I thought, or maybe even a full pantry. Feeling some of the excitement I'd carried with me through the beginning of the tour, I turned back to Murray, who was watching me closely from beside the door. Then, he spoke in a calm, friendly voice, very unlike the tone he'd favoured during the rest of our short conversations. Well, technically there's one more room in the house. The basement, he said with a small nod to the door he had been leaning against. Before I could respond or react, Murray barreled on. But I've been using the space as storage for a lot of my own crap through the years. The door stays locked, and the only key is mine. I hope you aren't offended, but I just don't want you messing around down there in all the old junk. I haven't kept it organized, and I worry someone else might stumble and hurt themselves. You understand? It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but my lizard brain was abuzz with the instinct to run from the house. Thoughts of crazy landlords keeping their tenants as slaves in their secret basement dungeons played out in my mind. My poker face being terrible, Murray must have seen the worry on my face. With a convincing laugh, he put his hands up in the air like he was surrendering himself. I know what you're thinking. Who is this guy, and what awful thing is going on in his basement that he doesn't want me to know about? We both laughed a little. I didn't feel much like laughing, but it got the tension a bit. He continued on. I swear, it's nothing like that. We can take a look if you want. He took his keys out of his back pocket and selected the necessary key. Again, he looked at me with raised eyebrows and a furrowed brow, waiting for a response. After a second of hesitation and a few more murder scenarios playing in my brain, I blinked and answered the man. Why not? The basement was very much just a basement. A concrete floor with shelves and boxes galore. Murray hadn't lied about the abundance of junk down there. He had to climb over several piles of it to reach the solitary light bulb that hung from the ceiling at the center of the room. Satisfied, I told Murray we could head back up. Back in the kitchen, Murray closed and locked the door once again, returning his keys to his pocket. Turning to me, he spoke again with nonchalance and dismissal. See, nothing crazy at all. Just a lot of junk someone could trip over. So do me a favor, huh? Don't worry about getting in there. Not without me. Looking to end what was starting to feel like a very strange encounter, I nodded quickly. This apparently wouldn't suffice. Murray spoke again, with harshness in his voice. I need you to say it. You will not try to go down there without me. You will leave it be. I stared at him for a moment, not exactly trying to hide the puzzlement on my face. He raised his eyebrows at me again, but the tiredness in his eyes had been replaced with clear focus now. My blood turning to ice in that gaze, I eagerly answered, Of course, I'll stay in my areas up here. I promise not to mess with the basement at all without you here. Murray held his cold gaze on me for another swollen moment before apparently deciding that my answer was acceptable. The tour was completed, and I hastily left the house, trying to focus on how good it would be to have my own place and a fresh start. All the while, That icy stare the older man had held me in made me jittery the entire drive home. Later that week, the papers were finalised and I had my keys. Gathering up some friends, I got moved in with relative ease, and all was right with the world. My buddies stayed over for a while once we were done to enjoy a well-deserved feast of pizza and beer. It was such a relief to just hang out and be happy in my new home, filling it up with warmth and light. As it got later, my friends began to head home one by one. When the last one had left, I locked the front door, turned, and rested my back against it. I looked up at the house and smiled wide. This is gonna be good, I said out loud to myself and the house. I turned towards my bedroom to hit the hay myself. 3 loud knocks came from somewhere in the house. Knock, knock, knock. Frozen in place, I perked my ears, half convinced I had imagined the sound. The silence stretched out forever, and a quiet ringing boomed in my ears. I let out my breath, trying to replace my sense of calm with oxygen. I began to move towards my room again. Knock, knock, knock. I whipped around. My heartbeat hammered in my ears like an echo of the knocking sound. This time, it was clear where the noise was coming from. The kitchen. Painfully aware of each sound I made, I inched my way back down the hall, through the living room and into the kitchen. I flipped the light switch and was greeted by that ominous white door on the far side of the room. It was sitting there, waiting for me, like it had invited me in for some coffee. In that moment, I couldn't make my feet move forward anymore, and I just stared at the door, waiting for another knocking noise to come and my sanity to go. I counted the seconds, then the minutes. 5 minutes went by with me standing stock still in my own kitchen, staring at the locked basement door. After 10 minutes, I was convinced I had a few too many and was content to end the night with a few more and a night of drunken sleep. Laughing a little, I reached in the fridge and grabbed a couple more beers. I walked back to the kitchen entrance and looked back at the basement door. It still looked like it was waiting for me there. I shook the thought off and flipped the light switch off. A thin, yellow light was leaking through the crack at the bottom of the basement door. I stared at it. There was no way it was real. Or maybe Murray had left the light on. But I hadn't seen the light before I hit the kitchen light switch walking in. It couldn't have been real. That's what I kept thinking. Reaching up, I hit the kitchen light switch again. And there was the basement door, stark white and almost smiling at me. Did you see? Are you sure you saw what you saw? Come a little closer, take another look. My hand was shaking on the light switch now, and I could feel my eyes bulging in their sockets. Slowly, I took a deep breath and let it out with a shudder. I would turn the lights off and there would be nothing. It was fine. I was fine. With a click, the kitchen lights went dark once more. What I saw then sent me scrambling back down the hall into my room, and I did not leave until the sun had returned the following morning. The yellow light still seeped out from under the door, broken by the unmistakable shadow of 2 feet. Knock, knock, knock. That first night, the beers that I clutched to me as I ran down the hall were the only things that let me get any sleep at all. I woke up the next morning squinting into the daylight leaking in through my curtains, and for a minute I couldn't remember what I had been afraid of. It was like waking up from a nightmare as the details of whatever horrible thing that haunted my mind faded out in the light of day. But my brain held on to the fear. My breath came in shallow jets from my nose, and my eyes scanned the room erratically. I didn't remember the source of my anxiety until I spied the boxes of unpacked clothes and books stacked in front of my bedroom door. Once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was taunting me. Peeking over the wall of boxes I'd built for some semblance of peace of mind. Wanting to rid my brain of that image, I closed my eyes and dropped my head into my hands with a tired sigh. Behind my eyelids, the basement door was waiting instead, glaring white in the light of the kitchen. The image flickered to my kitchen bathed in darkness. With dread, I watched the weak yellow light flare up under the door. Again, the image changed, and there, beneath the door, the shadow of feet, standing and waiting expectantly. Anyone home? I opened my eyes and was greeted with my own white bedroom door behind the boxes, a churning in my stomach threatening to bubble over. I flopped wearily back to my pillow. I've never really been one to believe in the supernatural, not out loud at least. There was always that section at the back of my brain that I tried desperately to keep quiet, the what-if part of my brain. As I laid there in my bed that morning, that part of my brain was screaming, demanding answers, and so I set out to get some. The first step was to check the house. Moving the boxes was a slow process. Not that they were heavy or that there were many of them. They were relatively light, and I'd only had 4 or 5 in the room with me. But every little noise the house made in the morning quiet was some stalking, lurking thing waiting on the other side of my bedroom door, at least in my mind. Nonetheless, I cleared the path out of my bedroom, cautiously opened the door inch by inch, and peered out into the rest of the house. The hallway was dark and quiet. Everything was still in the house, except for the loud ticking of the clock in the living room. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway. The bathroom off the hallway was clear. Nothing in the living room either. Everything was in the state that I'd left it the night before. 1 or 2 empty beer bottles on the coffee table, a pizza box lazily tossed by the front door. But I checked every corner, in the closet, under the couch even. Part of this was just me wanting to be thorough, but the larger part was the what-if part of my brain, just looking for reasons to put off going to the kitchen. Eventually, the kitchen was all that was left to check. As I crossed the threshold from the living room to kitchen, I couldn't make my eyes look up at the basement door. They were happy to scan the fridge and the cabinets for as long as can be. But the prospect of seeing that white door waiting for me again was making my head swim. But once again, at some point, all that's left to do is the thing you would do absolutely anything to avoid. I looked at the door. There it was. Just a door. It didn't stretch out at me or groan with the weight of 1,000 souls. It just sat there like it had been waiting for me to wake up. Hey there, how'd you sleep? Any dreams? I dreamed about you. I shook my head to clear the shadow puppets I was casting on the walls of my own mind. It was just a door, goddammit. This was my house, and I had to grow the hell up. With the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the ticking of the living room clock, I moved slowly towards the basement door. I was standing right in front of it before I noticed I was holding my breath. As noiselessly as I could, I exhaled and took a few slow, steady gulps of air. My heart shuddered, its beat in my chest sending shockwaves through my body. All the while, the door stood unmoved. I stood there for longer than I cared to admit, before finally reaching my hand out and trying the knob. To my trembling relief, it was securely locked. I tried a couple more times just to be sure, leaning my weight against the wood and gripping the knob tightly as I shook it. Nothing. I pressed my ear up against the door's surface and listened, holding my breath once more. 1 second ticked into 10, into 30, into a minute. Nothing. I breathed a deep lungful of air and let out gratefully as I stepped back from the door, momentarily satisfied with my lack of findings. As I turned and walked away from the basement door to the fridge, it seemed more and more likely that I'd scared myself into a semi-drunken stupor the night before. The cold leftover pizza from last night served as my comfort for the morning. I stood, leaning against the sink, and chomped on the slice of pepperoni, thankful for what was finally starting to feel like a normal enough morning. A tinkling sound came from behind the basement door, broke this temporary peace. I stopped chewing and listened intently. Silence filled the kitchen, sudden and overbearing. Then it came again, a tiny jangling noise that wasn't exactly unfamiliar. I had heard this noise before, but where? An image began to form in my brain. A thin cord dangling from the center of the ceiling connected to a solitary light bulb above several mounds of junk, as my middle-aged landlord fumbled for the chain. The chain danced across the glassy surface of the light bulb, making a small but unmistakable clinking sound. The sound repeated, outside of my head this time, and my eyes flew to the basement door. A new image of something ancient, decaying and dead, dragging itself across the piles of forgotten things and groping for the chain with skeletal fingers sprang into my brain. Despite the tremors rocketing through my hands, I moved slowly but steadily back toward the basement door. Again, I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. No light jangling noise came, but the clear sound of a chain being tugged. Looking down, I could see soft yellow light under the crack of the door. I couldn't believe it. It was like a nightmare had followed me out into the day. But there it was, regardless. With a great swell of will, I forced myself to stoop down on my knees and lowered my head slowly to the crack under the door. Knock, knock, knock. I fell backwards away from the door and scooted myself down the length of the kitchen, blubbering and stammering half words and squeaking sounds of fear. Through the crack, the shadow of 2 feet turned and moved back from the door. I heard the chain tugged again, and the light beneath the door disappeared. It was a mad dash, getting dressed and out of the house. I needed to be somewhere else. I called up my friend Pat and asked if I could swing by and hang out for a while. He said that'd be fine and asked if I was alright. With a shaky voice, I told him I was fine, because it's hard to explain over the phone that either you're going insane or your new house has some uninvited presence in the off-limits basement. I'd explain myself when I got there. Probably. On the way, I gave Murray a call. It went straight to voicemail. Murray McDonald's Properties. Leave your name, number and brief description of your reason for calling, and I will address your needs as I can. The beeping tone invited me to begin my message, and I didn't know what exactly to say. Quickly starting to speak, I gave my name and number along with my address. The last thing I said was definitely brief, but felt cartoonishly ominous coming out of my mouth, making me worry about how I would seem to anyone I talked to about this. There's something wrong with the basement. Please call me back ASAP. I left it at that and hung up, If he was allowed to be cryptic and unhelpful, then I was allowed to be nervous and vague. When I reached Pat's house, he had 5 guys for both of us, and I ate it gratefully, realizing how hungry I was. We munched and watched TV for a while, and my mind started to unclench from the night and morning I had gone through on my own. But the day went on, and the morning turned to afternoon. Soon it would be night, and I would be out of reasons to stay at my friend's place. Then, somewhere amidst the Netflix and video games, Pat asked me the question. "So, what was up this morning? You sounded pretty freaked out." For a moment, I debated telling Pat anything, because I already knew how crazy this all seemed. And this year hasn't been a stellar one for my mental well-being already. I've already worried some folks, but this wasn't that. I told Pat what had happened last night and this morning. He didn't laugh. He didn't give me that heavy look of concern that I'd received so often from so many others. He listened, and when I was done, he looked me in the eye with a strong, steady gaze. "Well, I think we should go back there together." "What?" "Look, man, either this is legitimately the freakiest thing to ever happen to anyone I know, or it's part of some of the stuff you've been working through. Either way, I don't want you to mess with it all by yourself." I faltered a little and returned his stare dumbly. He just smiled and spoke again. "I'll grab my stuff." Pat stood, clapped me on the back, and went to his room, returning with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked at me with eyebrows raised, like he was daring me to tell him no. Pat had always been a fierce friend of mine. I can't tell you how glad I was for him in that moment. We both climbed into my car, and I drove back to my house. We pulled up to the house as the sun was ducking beneath the horizon, laying dusk over the world like a blanket. My stomach was tight as we climbed out of the car. We reached the front door, and my phone went off, making us both jump. I looked at the screen. It was Murray. "It's the landlord," I told Pat, unlocking the door to let him in. "Let's see what he has to say." Pat laughed and went in the door. I accepted the call and put the receiver to my ear. "Do not go back in the house." The words boomed staticky and harsh from the phone, and the front door slammed shut in front of me. I dropped the phone and hammered my fist on the door, calling out to my friend. The doorknob didn't budge in my grip. Desperate, I tried my key once again, and they were flung out of the lock, whizzing past me into the yard. I watched them sail away from me, eyes wide. I slammed once more into the door, and it gave in, sending me spiraling into the hallway of the house. The door swung violently on its hinges and struck the wall, bouncing back for a lazy half swing. The house was completely dark, but I spied light on the wall of the living room opposite the kitchen. A shadow moved there, the shadow of a man. I slowly turned and moved out of the light. I called out then, "Pat? Where are you, Pat? We gotta go." I scurried forward on my hands and knees, rounding the corner into the living room. I stopped when I could see into the kitchen. The overhead lights were off. The only light was coming from the doorway to the basement. The door was open, and Pat was gone. The tinkling, tugging noise sounded once more, and the basement light went out. With a single light of source extinguished, shadows took the house. I stayed there on my knees, petrified. A strong wind blew against the side of the house, sending whispers through leaves and making the open front door sway listlessly. Goosebumps jolted across my skin like an electric charge, and my jaw clenched shut. A savage wailing sound came streaking up and out of the basement door, clawing its way down the length of the kitchen and embedding itself in my brain. This was a voice I knew. A friendly, loving voice on the end of a phone on my darkest of nights. It was a voice of pain. It was Pat's voice. I had never heard a noise like this come from a person. There was no words at first, just shapeless howls of agony. Every now and then, the wailing grew more intense or heightened in pitch. During these moments, a sound like thick, tightening ropes would crackle up from the dark bowels of the basement. The shrieking reverberated inside my skull, and I wanted to scream along with it. I wanted to shred my lungs with screaming and run until my heart burst in my chest like a merciful bomb. Then, 2 words came stretching and trembling across the incoherent exhalations of pain. "Help me!" The breath in my throat stuck there, and Pat's face swam to the front of my mind. Every one-sided phone call, late-night marathon of mindless stuff, and a bona fide cry for help that was answered without a moment's hesitation piled up inside of me, threatening to explode. My feet found the ground, and I was marching into the darkness of the kitchen like a soldier who had been called to battle. I had reached the sink, one palm skimming across the counter to guide me as I walked, when a strong hand gripped my shoulder and began to drag me backwards. I did scream then, a hoarse and breathless screech. I stumbled and slid across the kitchen tile on my ass. The hand did not relinquish its grip, and whoever had me continued to drag me away from Pete's howling voice without breaking stride. We passed the couch and coffee table, turned into the hall, and I was half tossed onto the stoop in front of the house. The door sounded like a coffin lid when it closed behind us. With a frantic drive, I pushed myself to my feet and turned to face my subduer. Murray pressed his back against the door, sweaty and breathless. His eyes burned in the last dying rays of sunlight on the horizon. "What were you doing in there?" he bellowed. "I told you not to go back in." My mouth dropped open as it filled with every baffled question and cry of outrage that my brain could produce in that moment. At first, all that would come out were useless strings of half-thoughts and accusations. Finally, I settled on the most condensed form of question my brain could concoct. "What the hell is going on?" My throat ached and my mouth felt like it was lined with dry lint. Murray seemed to calm somewhat, eyeing me closely and putting his hands up defensively as if to protest his right to be upset. "Well, that's hard to explain. There's a lot you don't understand." His eyes blazed with aggravation again, and he spat through gritted teeth. "I told you not to go down there, not to mess with it at all." "I didn't break your goddamn rules. I've barely gone near the damn thing." I took a step closer to the winded old man. "You better try to make me understand right now." Murray moved away from the door and returned my gaze steadily. The wind kicked up and rustled through the trees again. The boards of the house groaned. He looked away onto the lawn and took a deep breath before he began to answer. "I've never seen it happen so fast. Seen it decide it likes someone so quick." He grumbled out each word like they were bitter on his tongue. "I tried to keep an eye out for reactions like this, but I've been at this for a good long while, I'm only human, and I've got my limits. I'm afraid. Murray shuffled his feet and removed his baseball cap solemnly, mindlessly. I fought the urge to charge back into the house. The wailing from the basement wasn't audible from our place on the porch. My words came up quick and sharp. You're afraid what? What the hell are you talking about? He turned to face me again, the icy stare reappearing on his ancient-looking face. I'm afraid that it's learning. From me, from you, from every soul it comes across. I think it's gotten too talented and too efficient at pulling people apart, unraveling them. It's a hungry thing, whatever it is. It takes what it wants, when it feels like it's strong enough, or if it thinks someone's weak enough. What have you seen in this house? I debated whether or not to be honest with him. He hadn't done so much for me, but he had information I needed. Knocking on the kitchen door, I've seen the light turn on down there, and I've seen a shadow, feet beneath the door. I close my eyes and I can see it, the door, waiting for me. Murray looked down and shivered. I thought then it was pity. He turned away from me again and spoke softly with his gravelly voice. It likes to play with people, he sighed. I don't know what it is, not exactly. I don't know who would know that, but I know it's predatory. Most people, the lease comes and goes, and they're none the wiser. I don't know if it sleeps or it picks who it wants, but it's impossible for me to tell. I just set my rules and hope people get to end their time here thinking I'm just an eccentric old asshole with a senile streak. But every now and then, it sets sight on someone. I don't know what it is, but it's like it smells blood in the water. I got small complaints at first. Strange noises, light malfunctions, things gone missing. I checked for pests, leaks, ventilation problems, you name it. Nothing. It wasn't until the first tenant disappeared that I locked the basement up to anyone but myself. My eyes went wide, and my voice came in a whisper on the evening air. Disappeared? I hissed, hardly letting my mouth move to form the word. Murray flashed his eyes back at me over his shoulder. I came looking for the rent the first time it happened, gave my warning knocks and let myself in. Place was dark, darker than I was ready for, and it stank like chemical fire, real acrid. But the basement door was open. I went down the steps, and it felt like years before I reached the bottom. There was nothing but the light in the middle and shadows playing off the walls. And the shadows, they had him. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but they'd taken this young guy off into the dark. It stretched out everywhere, and I was scared to get lost in it. The wind kicked up again. Murray lowered his head, and his voice came in a husky rasp. I ran. There wasn't anything left the next day. Just the basement down there. Dust and cobwebs. The guy's stuff was still there, though. So I did the only thing I could think to do. There's no way I don't go to prison for this. I mentioned the basement, and you were immediately suspicious of me. It was just easier to store all the things that were left behind than to explain. He looked up at me, monitoring my reaction. Outrage burned in my cheeks, and my jaw hung open. So what? You've just been offering people to this thing? You've got to get your rent, I guess, What the hell is wrong with you? Murray turned to face me, and his eyes flashed like dying coals. His gruff voice wavered as he spoke. I tried to keep the house empty. You don't think that was the first thing I did? No way did I want to send another soul in there like home delivery for those things. I took the place off the market, deleted all the listings, and boarded the whole place up. Doors, windows, the damn chimney. I would have burned it down if it didn't look like an insurance scam. Screw it. Let it rot, right? He took a step closer to me, breathing his words into my face. But it's hungry, you see. It's predatory. About a month after I closed her off, I was in Chicago visiting my sister and a kid. They put me up in a hotel in the city, full suite and everything. I hadn't thought about this damn house for months. But when I went to turn in for the night, it was there. That light beneath the door. The line of stale yellow light peeking into the darkened world of the house appeared in my mind, and I looked down. Murray nodded grimly. It was there, beneath the hotel room door. It was the basement light. It went on and off for an hour before the knocking started. I thought I'd finally blown a circuit in my brain, but it made me just crazy enough to open the damn door. I looked at him again. The icy clear focus I saw there made me shake. He spoke again. The basement was there. It had followed me to Chicago. The light went out and something started coming up the steps towards me. I slammed the door and didn't sleep that night. The message was clear then. As long as there was someone between me and it'd be okay. But I had to rent the house out. You have to believe me. I had to. I wanted to hate him, to call him a coward. But thinking of the silhouette standing and waiting on the other side of the door, and the taunting, playful sound of the light bulb's chain being tugged, made me wonder what I wouldn't do to be free from this nightmare. Then, Pat's agonized voice came to my mind again, and my hands flew to my face at the thought of what was being done to him. Those sounds, those stretching, tightening sounds. A scream came lunging out of the recesses of the house, and both Murray and I spun to face the front door. I launched myself toward the entrance, but Murray sprang forward and grabbed me. He spoke through gritted teeth as I struggled to get free of his grasp. What was that sound? He's still in there. Murray swung me around and pressed me against the wall of the house. Jesus Christ, you brought someone else? A great shriek came from deep within the house, making Murray's jaw drop and loosening his grip on me. I pulled away from him and scrambled for the door, but his hands found me again. My words came in increasingly frantic breaths and sobs. Pat's in there. He's my friend, man. He's my friend, and he just wanted to help me. It's hurting him. Whatever it is, it's hurting my friend. It took him and it wanted me. I have to get him back. Get the hell off me. Tears had begun to streak down my cheeks. The older man held fast to the collar of my shirt, and pity flared up in his eyes. I'm sorry, but I don't think there is any getting him back. Anger bloomed in my brain again, a deliberate and unshaking spite for the situation. My friend, who was always there when I needed him, needed me. He came to help me, and it would take whatever demise the shadows that waited in the basement had planned for me to keep me from coming to help him. I shoved Murray away with unfamiliar strength and drew in deep, feverish breaths through my nose. You can't make me leave him. He wouldn't leave me. Murray looked at me, sadly, for a long second, before taking another step back. I'm sorry. I can't go back in there. I won't." He ran off the porch towards his waiting truck. Again, I wanted to judge him, but he only did what I wanted to do, what anyone would want to do. Bucking against the what-if lizard part of my brain that pulled at the reins of my mind. I turned slowly and entered the house again, the door shutting with a final sounding thud behind me. The shadows had grown thick in the few minutes I'd been outside with Murray. The growing twilight outside had blanketed the house in darkness that was growing every minute. In the living room, the clock ticked out the seconds, echoing into the emptiness. Pat's screams seemed to rocket hoarsely up and out of the basement in great strokes of pain. That sound was the only thing that spurred my footsteps forward. My eyes were adjusting to the shadows as I entered the tiled passageway to the basement door. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer beside the sink as I passed. This helped keep my steps at a steady pace until I reached the utter blackness of the open basement door, where the closed door looked like a waiting grin. It looked like an entrenched predator's mouth, waiting, daring some foolish animal to venture into the shadows. Daring some foolish animal to venture into the shadows, just for a moment. That's all it took. I stood at the edge of what felt like an abyss, trying to make myself jump. Pat screamed again, his voice tightening and screeching upwards until it became an animal squeal, and I stepped into the darkness. The steps moaned under my feet, and heat pressed thickly to my skin as I descended. When Murray had brought me down here in the day, there had been maybe 10 steps. That night I climbed down at least 100. All the while, Pat screamed wordlessly for help. I don't know how many steps I descended when they finally ended, and I fell outright into the pitch black void below. The ground found me quickly. I landed on my side and cried out, the air bursting out of me. When I looked up, I saw a fire in the center of the basement. Or what should have been the basement. This room was much, much larger than the one Murray had shown me the day of our tour. I tried, but couldn't even see the outer walls on any side of the room. The floor was smooth, flat concrete all around. It reflected the firelight dimly near the center of the chamber. The warm, weak light of the fire made a bright circle about 20 feet wide around itself. I edged into the light and scanned the seemingly massive chamber. Just in front of the fire itself, a shape caught my eye. Pat. I ran forward to help my friend, but slowed as I approached him. He was spread eagle on the ground. His eyes were shut tight, and he bared his teeth, gritting and spitting as high-pitched screams sprang from between his lips. My brain struggled to understand what was happening to him. At first, I thought he was being buried alive. It reminded me of the days at the beach as a kid, burying limbs and whole bodies in the sand to burst forth. The transition from limb to ground was so neat and smooth that my eyes hardly believed it. His legs stopped in a smooth, straight plane just below his knees, and the concrete began. But there was something I wasn't seeing. My brain floundering to process the visual input being presented. The noise, like straining rope, got louder, and Pat let out another shriek. That's when I saw what was happening. The denim of Pat's jeans pulled taut, stretched, and then faded into the concrete. I heard loud, crunching noises as my friend's knees collapsed like oversized pecans, sending a squeal out between his gritted teeth. Where his legs met the concrete, It seemed that his lower half was being stamped into the floor's surface. 2 legs, tennis shoes and jean cuffs included, appeared black and inky on the concrete. Pat's fingers dug at the floor behind him, trying to pull himself away from whatever force was slowly flattening and devouring his body. On the ground, the silhouette of Pat's legs began to shimmer and flicker in the firelight. It looked like the shadowy image was streaming, sending up a strong, bitter smell and stinging my eyes. I looked beside Pat's newly stamped shadow. A stone rose in my throat, and an audible gasp hissed between my lips. Another shadow crawled beside Pat. The shadow of a man that moved in jitters and shudders. The shape moved without anything to cast, and it was growing. It slithered up beside Pat and snaked what looked like claws up to the shadow being made of his lower body. Elongated fingers raked across the concrete where Pat's legs once were. Pat's body jerked and slid down away from the weak fire. His thighs looked like twin bubbles of denim toothpaste as they began to feed through whatever force had a hold of him. Another high squeal of anger spat out of Pat's lips, and I ran forward. Skirting the moving shadow, I came around Pat's left side and took his arm in both my hands. He looked up at me, straining to grip my hand as tightly as he could. His eyes were hopeful in that moment. I would get him out of this. We would make it. A violent, wrenching tug came from Pat's midsection, and it looked like his chest cavity went from 3 dimensions to 2 in the space of a second. The skin of Pat's face turned an impossible blue and purple colour, and blood jetted out of every orifice it could find. He made a noise like a vacuum cleaner sucking on a curtain. I think he was trying to breathe. All I can be sure of is I felt bones in my hands start to crack in Pat's death grip. I think he said one last thing to me. It's hard to be sure, but I think he did. I want to believe he did. Whatever helps us sleep, I guess. Run. It rasped its way out of his lips, and his eyes rolled back up into his skull. He was gone, and my feet found themselves again. I turned to flee, but was wrenched backwards by the iron grip still anchoring me to Pat's vanishing form. His hand clutched mine in an inescapable iron trap. I grabbed my trapped left hand with my free right hand and tugged desperately. The moving shadow gave another jerking motion. A whip went through Pat's body, and the rest of him sank into the concrete. A shaded imprint of Pat's form lay neatly stamped onto the floor. It shimmered and billowed like a cloud. There were no features on the now flat face. The pain and the blood were replaced by solid black. A mournful cry escaped my lips, and I struck the ground with my free hand. It occurred to me then that my left hand was still not free. Eyes wide, I slowly turned to look at it. My hand was sunken into the concrete. There, on the hard surface, appeared the 2-dimensional rendering of one hand gripping another. I stared at my wrist, now seemingly pressed flat against the shadow of my former hand. After a split second, the pain blossomed from underneath adrenaline, and a great crushing weight that presses in from everywhere focused in my wrist. I stared in disbelief as moving shadows slinked up around Pat's imprinted remains. The 2 black shapes swirled together, pulling around my wrist while I gaped. They shuddered, convulsed, and began to form something hulking and monstrous. And then the lurching, ripping, sucking feeling, like I was a stray spaghetti noodle in the gigantic mouth of the world. A strong, burning sensation seared its way across the nerves of my left hand, and that sound like thick rope being stretched whipped across my eardrums. My wrist began to sink deeper into the ground, bones crunching beneath that immeasurable force. I found my voice then, or it found me. A scream came rocketing out of my gut, wild and ragged in my throat. I wrenched my arm, working my shoulder and elbow violently. Images of animals caught in a hunter's trap swam through my mind, and the desperation that flooded my brain couldn't be described as anything but animal. It was a simple, growing certainty that I was going to be consumed. I was going to be eaten. There was no saving my friend. There was no escape. There was just the darkness rolling in to take away everything I was, like the tide melts away shapes etched in the sand. Then, one of my kicking legs caught one of the lit logs from the fire, sending it skating into the shadowy mass growing on the ground. The shadow shifted on the ground and fractured as the one source of light split into two. My wrist rose from the ground in a violent jerking tug. Bile rose in my throat, looking at the twisted nub that hung there. There was no hand at the end of my left wrist, but what looked like the gnarled, flesh-coloured version of the twist on the end of an old-fashioned candy wrapper. A snarling screech drew my eyes back to the concrete. The shadowy mass was swirling and writhing in front of me, tendrils striking out here and there. It wanted its second helping. I stumbled to my feet again and lurched for the stairs. My left arm hugged itself to my body as I lumbered forward. Behind me, the sound of the crackling fire was joined by a great, thundering howl. The ground shook beneath my feet. When I reached the stairs, I clambered up the first 3 and fell breathlessly, working to regain my footing. My eyes darted to the center of the large chamber once more. Spreading out from the dim light created by the fire, I saw an army of shades crouched and bent like feral animals stalking something smaller, something weaker. They all flickered and faltered in the firelight, but they were coming closer. I began to pull myself up the stairs, scrambling with all 3 still workable limbs and remembering the extended staircase I'd come down. As I climbed, screams and shrieks came echoing to my ears. Cries for help, screams of agony, and lonely pleas for someone to turn on the light. Below all the rest, a sound like 2 stones dragging over each other, slowly and steadily, reverberated through the walls. It grew louder and louder, and I thought I would lose my mind. The steps wouldn't stop, and the voices in the dark drenched me with despair. I closed my eyes and just kept climbing, while those sad, hungry sounds bored into my skull. When I reached the basement door, I spilled out into the kitchen and collapsed into a heap on the tile floor. I heard the door shut loudly behind me and flipped to my back, arms and legs raised to shield me from whatever had followed me out of the basement. Murray stepped forward and reached out a hand. "Come on, kid. We've got to go." I gripped his outstretched hand limply, and he hauled me to my feet. The momentum sent me swaying forward on my feet, and my vision swam. I collapsed into the larger man's arms, and the world went dark. I woke up in a hospital bed, bandages and gauze over my left wrist. They told me I'd been asleep for the better part of a day. The man who had brought me in was gone. They asked me a lot of questions. The doctors, the police, my friends. I didn't have answers for them. I could hardly bring myself to speak at all. What explanation could I give them? How could I even explain any of this to myself, honestly, without feeling like the lines of my reality were starting to go fuzzy? My parents insisted I come home and stay with them for a while. I accepted. Murray's phone was disconnected, and he disappeared off the web. I quit my job. My chest felt too heavy to sit up in the mornings. The days started to blur together. Sleep was my refuge for a while. I was on a sedative, and the dreamless periods of unconsciousness were like oxygen. A couple months after I started taking them, though, the dreams came back. Or I think they're dreams. I'm praying they're dreams. I go out in the hall, and there's a new door down at the end. My parents' house has plain plywood doors, washed dark brown. This door stands bright white on what used to be a solid wall bearing family memories and school photos. I know because those framed pictures are strewn in front of the place where they once hung. Beneath the door, there's a soft, yellow light radiating out into the darkness of the hallway. It glints off the glass of those pictures and twinkles in my eyes. I see the shadow of 2 feet appear, one after the other, on the other side of the door. The light footsteps can hardly be heard. I freeze solid, unable to move, unable to breathe. It knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I want to scream or run or die. I just want it to end. Let me go or let me die, please. And then the voice comes from beneath the pale wood. I think we should go back there together. Knock, knock, knock. I always wake up drenched in sweat. The lights aren't ever turned out in my room. I can't stand the thought of a room covered in shadows. But I eye every dark corner with suspicion, and my heart pounds in my chest. I don't get many restful nights. It happened every night the past week. I went to bed 2 nights ago, getting up in the wee hours to set them to wash. Last night I didn't sleep, but the door was there anyway. I heard the knocking from my bedroom. It was loud and demanding, echoing out into the house with every strike. I crept out into the hall from my bedroom, eyes on the ground. The knocks crashed out into the darkness, and I looked up. Hello again. I know it this time. You've been dreaming about me. I didn't stop dreaming about you. My lower lip trembled, and I thought I might weep. I lurched forward towards the door, and the pale yellow light appeared beneath. The tinkling of chain on light bulb echoed up from the non-existent basement beneath my parents' house, and I heard the groan of old wooden steps beneath heavy feet. The shadow appeared beneath the door when I approached its surface. That low sound I remember from the basement ground out from below, a sound like God grinding his teeth together. It crashed in around me, and I clutched my skull. The walls shook, and it felt like the house might collapse in on us at any moment. But the sounds disappeared, and the walls stood firm. The shaking stopped. A soft knocking came from behind the door. Knock, knock, knock. Help me, man. You have to help me. His voice was strangely calm, but his words were desperate. Then the doorknob began to jitter back and forth, softly at first, then violently. I stumbled back a step. You left me. You have to come back. You can't leave me. The doorknob shuddered and vibrated, and the soft knocking was replaced with deafening slams of force. Boom, boom, boom. I fled back to my bedroom, shutting the door and retreating beneath the covers. The thundering knocks resounded through the house, followed by a guttural howl. Then, I felt something on my hand. My left hand. At first, I couldn't pinpoint the feeling, nor grasp the regained sensation. My mouth hung open as I stared at the twisted place at the end of my wrist. The pain started, and I realized what the feeling was. Teeth. 100 little mouths were digging into the flesh of my stolen hand. I could feel each one tear into the skin and chew on the bone. I screamed out into the darkness, tears streaming down my face. I whimpered and swore and begged. Then, everything was quiet, and the pain was fading, numbing in the quiet. The voice came again. I want to help. Let me help. I woke up this morning, breathless and sweating. My left wrist aches. I'm afraid I can't reach Murray. His number has been disconnected. My parents won't be here this weekend. It's just me. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what's coming tonight. I'm afraid of seeing that door again. I'm afraid of hearing Pat's hurt, demanding voice. I'm afraid that if the door is there again tonight, and Pat comes knocking, I'll answer it. I'm afraid.